Commander Ashley Miller stood at the bridge of the UES Normandy, her knuckles white against the command rail, as she watched the massive Crexian battle fleet emerge from hyperspace. Their ships looked like obsidian arrowheads against the star-speckled void, each one nearly twice the size of Earth's largest vessels. The tactical display counted them methodically. 100, 200, 300 ships, against humanity's mere 37 defenders. "Ma'am," Lieutenant Parker's voice cracked slightly at his tactical station. "The Crexian flagship is broadcasting on all frequencies." Miller nodded, her jaw set tight. "Let's hear what they have to say." The alien voice filled the bridge, its translator making it sound like grinding metal. "Defenders of Sol system, your resistance has been noted. Your courage, while primitive, has earned you the honor of a clean surrender. You have 30 Earth minutes to power down your weapons and prepare for boarding. Any resistance will result in planetary bombardment." Miller looked around her bridge. She saw fear in her crew's eyes. Yes, but something else too. The same fire that had driven humanity to the stars in the first place. The same determination that had helped them survive first contact and build their fleet despite being centuries behind other races. "Send to all ships," she said, her voice steady. "Protocol Thermopylae is now in effect. Authorization Miller 770. The bridge crew stiffened. They all knew what that meant. Humanity's final auction. Turning their own ships into weapons, using their reactors not as power sources, but as bombs. Commander, her XO, Thomas Rodriguez, stepped closer. "The Crexians have never seen this tactic. They don't know our reactors can be overloaded this way, if we time this right." Miller's lips curved into a grim smile. "Lieutenant Parker, get me fleet-wide. And pipe some music through the tactical channels. Something classic." As Parker worked his console, the opening riffs of AC/DC's Thunderstruck began blasting across all frequencies. Miller saw confusion ripple through the Crexian fleet as they received what must have seemed like nonsensical noise to them. "To all Earth ships," Miller's voice carried across the fleet. "The history books say Leonidas and his 300 Spartans died at Thermopylae. But what those books remember most is how damn expensive they made that victory for Xerxes. Today, we're going to make the Crexians pay for every inch of space they take. Plot collision courses. Prepare reactor overrides. And for God's sake, people, show them how humans die." The response was immediate. Cheers erupted across the frequencies. Human ships began accelerating toward the Crexian fleet, their reactors already beginning to whine with dangerous energy buildup. "They're scanning us," Parker reported, his fear now replaced with fierce concentration. "They're detecting the power spikes, but they seem confused." "Of course they are," Rodriguez laughed. "What kind of species intentionally blows up their own ships?" The answer, of course, was humanity. As the distance closed, Miller watched her tactical display light up with escape pod launches. They'd practiced this. Minimal crews would remain to guide the ships in, while the rest of the crew escaped. Some pods would make it. Many wouldn't, but Earth would have a chance. The first impacts were spectacular. The UES Bangalore, already crippled from a previous battle, slammed into a Crexian dreadnought at relativistic speed. The reactor detonation that followed created a miniature sun, consuming both ships and 3 others nearby. The Crexians, finally realizing what was happening, began evasive maneuvers. But they were packed too tightly together, their formation designed for conventional combat. Like bowling pins, Miller whispered, then keyed her comm again. "All ships, pick your targets. Make them remember this day." Across all frequencies, human crews began broadcasting. Ancient battle hymns mixed with modern music. Some ships broadcast the laughter of their suicide crews, while others recited famous last stands from human history. The psychological impact on the Crexians was immediate. Their tight formation began to break apart. As the Normandy accelerated toward its own target, Miller thought she could almost hear the confusion in the Crexian communications. They had expected a civilized surrender from a technologically inferior species. Instead, they got AC/DC and kamikaze attacks. Reactor at critical, the engineering AI reported calmly. Impact in 15 seconds. Miller looked at her remaining bridge crew, each one who had volunteered to stay. Let's show them how humans fight. Hit the music, Lieutenant Parker. As the final countdown began to play, humanity taught the galaxy its first lesson about fear. Sometimes, the most terrifying enemy isn't the one who fears death, but the one who greets it with a smile. High Counselor Vexthra's facial tendrils twitched with barely contained distress as the holographic footage played before the Galactic Council for the 13th time. The chamber, designed to host representatives from 57 spacefaring civilizations, had never been so silent. "Play the audio again," demanded the Crexian representative, his scales shifting from deep purple to an agitated red. The sound of human laughter filled the chamber, accompanied by what the analysis claimed was an ancient Earth war song called Highway to Hell. The footage showed human ships deliberately ramming into Crexian vessels while their crews continued broadcasting signals that mixed combat coordinates with musical lyrics and historical quotations. "Impossible," muttered the Zentari ambassador, her crystalline form reflecting the holographic light. "No species would sacrifice entire crews for tactical advantage. It defies all rational military doctrine." A side door opened, and 2 guards escorted in their prize witness. Lieutenant James Cooper, one of the few human officers captured during the battle. Despite being bound in gravitational restraints, he walked with an easy swagger that made several council members shift uncomfortably in their seats. "Lieutenant Cooper," High Counselor Vexthra began, "we've reviewed the footage of your species. Unusual tactics. Perhaps you could explain why your commander chose to destroy her own fleet." Cooper glanced at the still-playing hologram and grinned. "Looks like a successful battle to me. We're still here, aren't we?" "You call this success?" The Crexian representative rose from his seat, towering over Cooper. "Your forces were annihilated." "Yeah, but you should see the other guys." Cooper winked. "By the way, how many ships did you lose to our annihilated fleet?" The Crexian scales darkened to almost black. The answer was well known. Nearly 40% of their attack force had been destroyed or critically damaged by the humans' suicide tactics. "What we don't understand," interjected the Zentari ambassador, "is why your species chose mutual destruction over honorable surrender." Cooper's grin faded slightly, replaced by something that made several council members lean back instinctively. "Ma'am, with all due respect, you're asking the wrong question. The real question is, now that you know what 37 ships and a few thousand humans are willing to do, what do you think we're capable of when we're actually trying to win?" The chamber erupted in murmurs. Vexthra raised all 4 arms for silence. "Are you suggesting this was not a serious military engagement?" "Oh, it was serious, all right," Cooper chuckled. "But it wasn't a battle. It was a message. You see, humans have this funny habit of studying history. We remember Thermopylae, the Alamo, Masada, places where the defenders knew they couldn't win, but fought anyway. Not just fought. They made victory so expensive that it haunted their enemies for generations." He looked around the chamber, meeting alien eyes steadily. "You folks think we're primitive because we're younger than you, because our ships aren't as advanced, our weapons not as powerful. But here's the thing about humans. We've spent our entire history fighting enemies bigger and stronger than us, and we got really, really good at it." The Crexian representative activated a different hologram, showing human crews singing what appeared to be drinking songs while setting their reactors to overload. "You treat death like a game. Your species lacks all military discipline." Cooper actually laughed at that. "You know what humans did before we had spaceships. We used to jump out of perfectly good airplanes for fun. We climb frozen mountains because they're there. We invented something called freestyle solo climbing, where we scale cliffs without safety equipment. Heck, we have sports where the whole point is to get hit in the head repeatedly. He leaned forward, his restraints humming. So yeah, we treat death differently than you folks. Because every human knows two things. We're all going to die eventually, and until then, we get to choose how we live. Commander Miller and her crew. They chose to die making sure Earth's enemies learned an important lesson. And what lesson is that? Vextra asked quietly. That humans don't fight like you. We don't follow your rules of engagement. We don't share your definitions of victory and defeat. And most importantly, Cooper's grin returned, fierce and proud. We make really bad enemies. Because we're the species crazy enough to punch a god if we think he deserves it. As the council chamber erupted in chaos, Cooper settled back in his restraints, humming Highway to Hell under his breath. The message had been delivered. Now it was just a matter of waiting to see who would be smart enough to listen. Dr. Michael Reynolds sat on the examination table, watching with undisguised fascination as his Crexian captors reviewed their latest test results. They thought they were studying him, but he'd spent the last 3 weeks studying them right back. Their scales shifted colors with their emotions, purple for confusion, red for anger, and an interesting shade of green he'd begun to associate with fear. Right now, lead researcher Ixel was displaying a particularly vivid shade of purple. This makes no sense, Ixel said, mandibles clicking in agitation. You've been awake for 72 hours. 73 and counting, Reynolds corrected cheerfully. You know, back on Earth, I once stayed awake for nearly 5 days during my residency. Terrible habit. Really. Had the most fascinating hallucinations by the end. Would you like me to describe them? The research team's scales rippled with green. They'd learned early on that humans could function, even think critically and solve complex problems, while experiencing what they called hallucinations. The concept terrified them. Your species should not be able to function like this, another researcher, Dr. Krev, insisted. The physical strain alone. Oh, that reminds me. Reynolds interrupted, pulling up his sleeve to show a half-healed cut. Remember this from last week's stress tests. Look how nicely it's healing. You know, humans can regrow entire fingertips under the right conditions. Shall we try that next? The entire research team took an involuntary step back. Their scales now showed a mix of green and purple that Reynolds had never seen before. He made a mental note to add it to his own research journal, the one he was keeping in his head, categorizing every reaction, every weakness, every hint of Crexian psychology he could gather. What I find most disturbing, Ixel continued, trying to maintain his professional demeanor, is your continued enthusiasm for these tests. Reynolds shrugged. Why wouldn't I be enthusiastic? Do you know how many xenobiologists would kill for this kind of cross-species research opportunity? Speaking of which, I've been meaning to ask about your digestive system. That triple helix enzyme structure you use is fascinating. Have you ever considered its potential applications in breaking down complex toxins? Krev dropped his datapad. How do you know about our enzyme structure? Oh, I've been analyzing the nutrient paste you've been feeding me. Did you know I can taste the individual molecular components? Human taste buds are surprisingly complex. We developed them to detect poisons, back when we were persistence hunting on the savannas. Actually, that reminds me. I've been meaning to ask about your species' flight response. I notice your scales shift slightly before you physically move away from threats. Is that an autonomic response, or can you control it? The research team stared at him in horror as they realized what he was saying. While they had been conducting their tests, categorizing human resilience and pain tolerance, he had been conducting his own research. Every reaction, every conversation, every meal had been an opportunity for him to study them. This is not possible, Ixel whispered. You are the test subject. Reynolds smiled. It wasn't an entirely friendly expression. You know what humans did before we reached the stars. We studied every predator that tried to eat us until we figured out how to turn them into pets. We took wolves, apex pack hunters, and turned them into puppies. We looked at the most dangerous animals on our planet and thought, I bet we can ride that. So yes, I'm your test subject. And you're mine. He leaned forward, causing the entire team to take another step back. Now about those enzyme structures. I have some theories about how we could modify them to enhance their efficiency. Would you like to collaborate on a paper? I'm thinking we could co-publish in the Galactic Journal of Xenobiology. It would be a fantastic example of interspecies scientific cooperation. As the research team's scales shifted through every color they were capable of displaying, Reynolds began humming contentedly. He'd identified 13 new autonomic responses, documented their basic cellular structure, and mapped out their primary stress indicators. Not bad for 3 weeks' work. Plus, he'd finally figured out what that green-purple scale combination meant. The dawning realization that they weren't studying a lesser species. They were locked in a laboratory with something that saw their most sophisticated research techniques as a learning opportunity. So, he said brightly, shall we discuss your molting cycle next? I have some fascinating hypotheses about your exoskeletal regeneration rate. The sound of data pads clattering to the floor was almost as interesting as the new color their scales turned. Ambassador Emily Harrison strode into the grand chamber of the Galactic Council, carrying a leather briefcase in one hand and a bottle of Maker's Mark bourbon in the other. The assembled alien diplomats watched in bewildered silence as she placed both items on the ornate negotiating table. First, she announced, pulling out crystal glasses from her briefcase, we're going to have a drink. The Zentari ambassador's crystalline form flickered with confusion. The session was called to discuss the recent military incident. Exactly, Emily interrupted, pouring 3 fingers of bourbon into each glass. And in human diplomacy, the serious talks always start with a drink. It's a trust thing. She smiled warmly. Also, I've been told this particular bourbon is safe for most carbon-based life forms. At our xenobiologists, check it twice. High Counselor Vexfer's facial tendrils curled in what Emily had learned was their expression of diplomatic distress. Ambassador Harrison, your species has destroyed a significant portion of the Crexian fleet using unprecedented tactics. This is not a social occasion. Oh, I know. Emily took a sip from her glass. That's why I brought the good stuff. Now, before we begin, I have a brief presentation. Computer, please play file Harrison Alpha 1. The chamber's holographic system activated, displaying what appeared to be a human in primitive protective gear standing at the edge of a platform high above a planet's surface. This, Emily explained, is called base jumping. It's a human recreational activity. Computer, play. The assembled diplomats watched in horror as the human leaped off the platform, plummeting toward the ground before deploying a thin fabric device to slow their descent. Many representatives physically recoiled. And this, she continued as the display changed, is something we call free solo climbing. No safety equipment, just a human and a cliff face. Oh, and this next one is my personal favorite. It's called mixed martial arts. For the next few minutes, the chamber was filled with footage of humans voluntarily engaging in what appeared to be recreational combat, extreme sports, and increasingly dangerous activities. The Crexian representative's scales had turned an unprecedented shade of gray. Ambassador, he managed finally, are you suggesting these are military training exercises? Emily laughed, pouring herself another bourbon. Oh no, these are just things we do for fun. You should see what we do when we're actually training for combat. She paused thoughtfully, though I suppose the line gets blurry sometimes. Computer, show the clip from last year's X Games. The footage switched to a human performing complex aerial maneuvers on something the subtitle identified as a motocross bike. Your species does this for entertainment. The Zentari ambassador's voice contained a note of horror that her crystalline translator couldn't quite filter out. Among other things, Emily nodded. My brother broke 3 ribs doing that last move. Mom was so proud. His first major sports injury. She beamed at the memory. He was back on the bike 2 months later. Humans heal pretty quick, you see. This explains much, Vexfer said slowly. The tactics used against the Crexian fleet were pretty tame by human standards, Emily finished. I mean, those pilots at least had a clear military objective. Unlike, say, she gestured at the hologram, which now showed humans jumping from orbit in specialized suits. These folks, who do it because, and I quote, it looks cool. She stood up, straightening her diplomatic uniform. Which brings us to the point of today's meeting. You're all wondering if humans are too dangerous to join the galactic community. If what did the report call it? Our pathological disregard for self-preservation makes use an unacceptable risk. Emily picked up the bourbon bottle, studying its label thoughtfully. But here's the thing. Humans don't actually have a death wish. We just have a different understanding of what makes life worth living. We push boundaries. We take risks. We do the impossible because someone said we couldn't. She poured one last round for anyone brave enough to try it. So yes, we're dangerous, but we're also the species that turned our most ancient predators into beloved pets. We're the ones who see a deadly challenge and turn it into a sport. We're the people who look at the impossible and say, watch this. The chamber was silent as her words sank in. Finally, Vexfer spoke. What exactly are you proposing, Ambassador? Emily's smile widened. I'm proposing you stop seeing us as a problem to solve and start seeing us as an opportunity. Because if you think what we did with 37 ships was impressive, she raised her glass. Wait until you see what we can do as allies. Major Ryan Thompson stood in the training arena of the newly established Interspecies Combat Academy, watching as his most promising student, a young Zentari named Crystal Song, attempted to explain the concept of last stand to her classmates. It's not just about fighting until you die, she said, her crystalline form glowing with excitement. It's about making your defeat so costly that it becomes a victory of another kind. Thompson smiled. 3 months ago, Crystal Song had been like the others, bound by rigid tactical doctrines and unable to comprehend why anyone would fight a battle they couldn't win. Now she was teaching human combat philosophy to a class that included 2 Crexian defectors. Major, one of the Crexians raised his scaled hand. I found something in your historical archives called the Charge of the Light Brigade. Was this another example of human victory through defeat? Pull it up on the holo display, Thompson instructed. The room filled with images of ancient human cavalry charging against artillery. 673 humans on horseback charged straight into Russian cannons. It was a military disaster born of miscommunication. Then why do you still remember it? Asked a Volunian student, their tentacles writhing in confusion. Because, Crystal Song answered before Thompson could. They did it anyway. They knew it was wrong, knew it was suicide, but they did their duty with such courage that their enemies couldn't help but admire them. The defeat became a symbol of human spirit. Thompson watched as understanding dawned across alien faces. This was why the Crexian Empire had banned his training videos. Not because of the combat techniques, but because of the ideas behind them. Your historical database has been accessed over 10 million times across galactic networks, his AI assistant reported privately through his neural link. Most popular searches include Thermopylae, Alamo, and Winston Churchill speeches. He'd known the training program would be popular, but this was beyond his expectations. Alien species weren't just learning human combat techniques. They were devouring human history, finding inspiration in Earth's greatest last stands and most desperate hours. Today we're going to learn about guerrilla warfare, Thompson announced, bringing up new holograms. Humanity has a long history of smaller forces defeating larger ones through unconventional tactics. We call it asymmetric warfare, and it's been a part of our military doctrine since before we had written language. The class leaned forward eagerly. They'd all heard about how 37 human ships had bloodied the nose of the mighty Crexian fleet. Now they were learning the principles behind such tactics. "Sir," one of the Crexian defectors spoke up, "is it true that humans have something called action movies, where you recreate combat for entertainment?" Thompson grinned. "Computer, play the helicopter scene from Predator." The room filled with the sound of minigun fire and Arnold Schwarzenegger's famous one-liners. The aliens watched in fascination as a single human warrior faced off against an advanced alien hunter. "This is propaganda?" asked a confused Volunian. "No," Thompson laughed. "This is entertainment. We turn our greatest fears into adventure stories. We take the terror of being hunted and turn it into something we watch for fun. Then we take what we learn from these stories and turn it into real combat doctrine." Crystal Song's crystalline form vibrated with understanding. "Like Protocol Thermopylae, you named it after an ancient defeat that became a symbol of courage." "Exactly." Thompson brought up new training holograms. "Now, who wants to learn about something we call the Hail Mary Pass?" As his students eagerly gathered around, Thompson received another update from his eye. 3 more Crexian military units had requested access to human historical records. The Empire's attempts to contain the spread of human ideas was failing spectacularly. Because that was the thing about humans. They didn't just adapt to survive. They turned survival into an art form, then taught that art to anyone willing to learn. And in a galaxy full of species bound by rigid doctrine and predictable tactics, the appeal of human unpredictability was proving irresistible. "Remember," Thompson told his class, "in human combat philosophy, the goal isn't just to win. It's to make the enemy think twice about fighting you again. And sometimes, the best way to do that is to show them something they've never seen before." The aliens nodded, taking notes as their teacher began to explain how a single human, with a primitive bow, had once held off an entire army at a bridge called Stamford. General William Davidson stood at the viewport of the UES Gettysburg, watching as the Crexian shuttle requested permission to dock. This would be the 3rd group of defectors this week, and each new arrival made the Empire more desperate to stop what they were calling the human corruption. "Sir," his XO, Commander Rachel Martinez, appeared at his side. "The shuttle's commander is requesting to speak with you personally. Says he has something called the Harrison Protocols." Davidson smiled. The ambassador's Bourbon diplomacy had spawned an unofficial network of Crexian officers who'd chosen to embrace human ideas rather than fight them. They'd named their underground movement after her. "Put him through to my private channel," Davidson ordered, then switched to the translator feed. "This is General Davidson. Identify yourself." "Squadron Leader Kextol, formerly of the Imperial 3rd Fleet," came the reply. "I bring 27 officers and 112 crew members seeking asylum. We wish to learn your ways." Davidson noted the hesitation in the alien's voice. Something specific prompted this decision. What was it? There was a long pause. 2 days ago, one of my crew was injured during a training exercise. According to Imperial protocol, he should have been terminated due to combat inefficiency. Instead, I remembered the story one of your POWs told about something called the No Man Left Behind principle. "Go on," Davidson encouraged, though he already knew where this was heading. "I ordered the crew to save him. We succeeded, but when I reported the incident, my superior ordered me to execute everyone involved for protocol violation." Kextol's voice hardened. "I refused. My crew stood with me. We chose to act like humans." Davidson exchanged glances with Martinez. This was how it always started. One small act of compassion, one decision to value life over protocol. The Empire's rigid hierarchy had no defense against the virus of human empathy. "Docking permission granted," Davidson said. "Welcome to the family." As the shuttle approached, Martins pulled up the latest intelligence reports. "Sir, the Empire's getting desperate. They've instituted something called mental purity protocols. Mandatory testing to identify soldiers contaminated by human ideas." "Let me guess," Davidson chuckled. "It's not working." "Worse than that, sir. It's backfiring. The more they try to suppress human concepts like individual initiative and unit loyalty, the more their troops seek out information about us. The Harrison protocols have gone viral through their neural networks." Davidson watched as the shuttle docked. He'd been a student of military history long enough to recognize what was happening. The Empire was fighting a war they couldn't win. Not against human ships or weapons, but against human ideas. "Sir," a junior officer called out, "you're going to want to see this. We're picking up transmissions from inside Crexian space. They're broadcasting human music." The bridge speakers crackled to life with the opening chords of "Fortunate Son." Somewhere in enemy territory, Crexian crews were learning about human culture through rock and roll. "They're not just playing the music," Martins reported, reading through signals intelligence. "They're analyzing the lyrics, studying the historical context. There's an underground network of Crexian officers writing papers on human military history and civil disobedience." Davidson remembered something Ambassador Harrison had said: "You can't quarantine an idea." The Empire was learning that lesson the hard way. The shuttle's airlock cycled, and Davidson went to meet his new recruits. The Crexians stood at attention, their scales shifting through nervous colors until they saw his smile. "At ease," he said through the translator. "First thing you need to learn about humans, we're big on handshakes." He extended his hand to Kextel, who had clearly studied the gesture. The Crexian's grip was firm, his scales settling into a calm blue. "Second thing," Davidson continued, "is that we believe in second chances. You're not defectors or traitors in our eyes. You're people who made a choice to stand up for something bigger than protocol." "What will you do with us?" one of the junior officers asked. Davidson's smile widened. "We're going to teach you everything. How to think independently, how to value life over orders, how to turn defeat into victory. And then you're going to help us teach others. Because that was the real victory, not the battles won or ships destroyed, but the minds and hearts changed. The Empire could ban human media, forbid human ideas, and punish human-like behavior. But they couldn't stop their own troops from looking at humanity and seeing something worth emulating." "Welcome to the revolution," Davidson said. "Now, who wants to learn about something we call rock and roll?" Supreme Warlord Kfax found his son, once again watching forbidden human historical archives in their private quarters. Instead of punishing him this time, he paused to watch the footage of something called the Battle of Britain. "Father," young Teleric started, his scales shifting to defensive colors. "I can explain." "No need," Kfax said, settling into his observation couch. "I've been studying them too." The holo display showed primitive human aircraft, hopelessly outnumbered, rising to meet a superior force. The narration spoke of Churchill's famous words, "Never was so much owed by so many to so few." "What fascinates you about these archives?" Kfax asked his son, though he already knew the answer. He'd been asking himself the same question for months. "They keep fighting when they should surrender," Teleric said, his youth making him more direct than diplomatic. "And sometimes they win, not because they're stronger, but because they don't understand they're supposed to lose." Kfax's scales rippled with amusement. "An interesting observation. Show me more." For the next hour, father and son watched footage of human conflicts. The ancient Spartans at Thermopylae, the Swiss Guards' last stand at the Vatican, the siege of Baston. Time after time, Humans faced with certain defeat chose to fight anyway, and their very defiance changed the course of history. "Do you know why I ordered the attack on Earth?" Kfax asked finally. "The intelligence reports said they were technologically inferior," Telerix recited. "Their fleet was small, their weapons primitive. Yes, by every logical measure, they should have been an easy conquest." Kfax's scales shifted to the deep purple of contemplation. Instead, they did something no species in our database had ever done. They turned their own ships into weapons and their defeats into victories. He stood, walking to his private terminal. "Watch this." The display changed to show recent footage. A human child failing at some sort of physical competition. Instead of being culled from the program, as would happen in Crexian society, the child was encouraged to try again. And again. And again. "I've watched this recording 17 times, Kfax said. "The child falls 39 times. On the 40th attempt, success. In our society, we would have declared the child unfit after the first failure. The humans. His scales shifted to a color his son had never seen before. They celebrate the falls as much as the success." "I don't understand," Telerix admitted. "Neither did I, until I started studying their history, their literature, their philosophy." Kfax brought up his private research files. Humans have a concept called learning from failure. They don't just accept defeat. They study it, analyze it, draw strength from it. He showed his son more footage. Human training exercises where failures were discussed and analyzed, human entertainment where heroes lost battles but won wars, human sports where coming in last place was celebrated if the athlete had done their best. "We fear humans," Kfax said quietly, "because they have mastered something we never could. The art of turning fear into strength. When we face defeat, we calculate the odds and surrender. When they face defeat, they calculate the odds, and then ignore them completely." He turned to his private terminal, beginning to compose a message to the Emperor. "Our attempts to contain human influence are failing because we don't understand what we're fighting. It's not their technology or their tactics that make them dangerous. It's their relationship with failure itself." "What do you mean, Father?" "In all our history, we have never lost a war because we never fight battles we cannot win. The humans." Kfax's scales rippled with a mix of horror and admiration. "They have lost countless wars, yet they still exist. More than that, they grow stronger with each defeat. They learn. They adapt. They remember." He finished his message to the Emperor. "We fear humans not because they are powerful, but because they transform their fears into strength. They do not break. They rebuild themselves stronger after every failure, and now they are teaching others to do the same." Looking at his son, Kfax made a decision that would change the course of the Empire. "Telerix, what would you say to attending their new interspecies military academy?" His son's scales lit up with excitement, and Kfax knew he had made the right choice. The Empire could either learn from humanity or be left behind by those who did. After all, he added, watching the human child finally complete their challenge, "Sometimes the greatest victory is admitting you have something to learn from your enemy." Colonel Jessica Hayes stood before the first graduating class of the Interspecies Military Academy on Mars, looking out at faces that would have been enemy combatants just 2 years ago. The auditorium was packed with Crexians, Centauri, Volunians, and a dozen other species, all here to learn the art of being human. "When I was asked to give this commencement speech," she began, "I spent a long time thinking about what makes humanity special. It's not our technology. Half of you come from species far more advanced than us. It's not our physical capabilities, though Dr. Reynolds would argue otherwise." A ripple of laughter went through the crowd. The doctor's enthusiastic research had become legendary among the student body. What makes us special is something much simpler. We never learned when to quit. She gestured to the massive window behind her, showing the terraformed Martian landscape. Look at this planet. When humans first arrived here, it was trying to kill us. The air was toxic. The soil was poison. The radiation would have cooked us alive. So what did we do? You made it adapt, shouted a young Crexian cadet, his scales bright with excitement. No, Hayes smiled. We adapted. We changed ourselves, our technology, our very definition of what was possible. And then, just to prove a point, we changed the planet too. She walked along the stage, making eye contact with various students. I see former enemies who've become family. I see species that were told they could never work together, now training side by side. I see the future of the galaxy, and it looks a lot like humanity's past, full of impossible challenges just waiting to be overcome. The holo displays activated, showing footage from Earth's history. Not the military battles this time, but other kinds of heroism. Firefighters running into burning buildings, paramedics working through disasters, ordinary citizens risking everything to help strangers. This is what we call the human spirit, Hayes continued. It's not about being fearless. It's about being afraid and acting anyway. It's about knowing you might fail and trying regardless. It's about understanding that sometimes the greatest victories come from getting back up after you've been knocked down. A young Zentari raised her crystalline form. Colonel, is it true that humans have something called the Medal of Honor that's often awarded after death? Yes, Hayes nodded. We celebrate those who give everything for others. Not because we love death, but because we understand that some things are worth dying for, and that makes them even more worth living for. She could see the concept landing with her audience. Species that had once seen humanity as primitive were beginning to understand the power of their philosophy. Your training year hasn't just been about combat tactics or military strategy, Hayes continued. It's been about learning to think like humans, to see failure as a teacher, not an end, to understand that unity comes from choice, not force, to know that the strongest teams are built on trust, not fear. She noticed Supreme Warlord Cathax's son in the front row, his scales showing the calm blue of deep understanding. Next to him sat Ambassador Harrison's protege, a young Volunian who'd mastered the art of bourbon diplomacy. You're not just graduates, Hayes said, her voice carrying through the hall. You're pioneers. You're going to take what you've learned here and spread it across the galaxy. And some will call it a virus, this human way of thinking. They'll try to stop it, to contain it, to cure it. She paused, letting her words sink in. But that's the thing about human ideas. They don't spread through force. They spread because they work. They spread because deep down, every sentient being wants the freedom to try, to fail, to learn, and to try again. The sunrise over Mars cast the room in a red glow as Hayes delivered her final words. You came here to learn about human military tactics. Instead, you learned something far more powerful. You learned how to be afraid the way humans are afraid. Not paralyzed by fear, but inspired by it. Not controlled by failure, but taught by it. She raised her hand in salute, and every graduate, former enemies, and old allies alike, rose as one to return it. Class of 2025, you are dismissed. Go forth and show the galaxy what you've learned about the human way. And remember, it's not about being fearless. It's about being afraid and moving forward anyway. That's what makes us human. That's what makes us strong. And that's what will make the galaxy strong too. As the applause thundered through the hall, Hayes watched the sun rise over a Mars that had once been impossible to live on, and smiled. The galaxy was about to learn what humanity had known all along. Nothing was truly impossible if you were stubborn enough to keep trying.